All right, folks, today we're going to talk about what is probably my favorite chapter altogether, because now we're really putting it together and really making sure we understand the underpinnings, which is the principles of exercise training. So at the very bottom, I've got a quote from Harrington Emerson, which I'm going to read because I think it's awesome, which is, "As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." Now, there's nothing wrong with liking this method or that method. When I was younger, I thought the only way to make someone awesome was through barbell lifting. There was no option other than picking up a heavy object and putting it down. But now I realize it's more about progression, whether we start with a bodyweight exercise, a kettlebell, a dumbbell, a barbell, myriad of potential machines. All of those are going to lead us eventually to increasing strength like we're looking for with our individual. But it's about the principles. If you understand the principles, the basic underpinnings of any training program, you're going to be able to look at it and think about it critically. Does this program work? Is this program specific to what we're looking for? Is there something that's going to progress them? Is it taking into account the individual differences? A myriad of different variables, but the key principles. So we're going to go through some basic terminology, then we're going to go through the general principles of training. We're going to talk a little bit about resistance training and anaerobic and aerobic training programs. Now, whenever we really are going to get into the resistance training, so I'm going to preface it here, and I'll bring it up again in some of the later lectures, which is this book was written by people that are very, very, very much so aerobic files. They really like aerobic exercise, and that's fine. But the problem is they kind of pay lip service to resistance training, giving some recommendations that are bonkers. That's the clinical term for it, of things that you're not going to be able to get mere mortals to do. But if you don't really understand something, you can give recommendations that are straight up Fruit Loops, where if you do understand it, you understand that, yeah, that probably doesn't work like that. But the aerobic recommendations are actually pretty good. They're pretty solid. They're pretty well defined. But the other, and this is a long-term thing, but it's how science, when it has issues with individual biases. And what I mean by biases is people that, no one likes to know they're wrong. No one likes to hear that they made the wrong choice. And so we fight hard in a variety of ways to defend our ego and make sure that it's always going to be safe and sound. And the problem when it comes to training in the exercise science direction is, for the longest time, there was a lot of arguments that strength training was effectively going to make you too tight, too slow, and effectively ruin your athleticism and just make you too bulky. And this still stays alive to a certain extent to this day. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds there. If you want a chance, there's a pretty good podcast. I think it's called The Body of Science, The Body of Evidence, with my friend Andy Galpin, where he talks about like one of the major turning points on this, which was actually thanks to Bob Hoffman and the York Barbell Club, effectively making one of the greater researchers at the time realize that he was wrong about his assumptions when it came to what barbell lifting would do for an individual. And that helped kind of turn the tide. But that wasn't until the 50s and 60s. As far as the fact that aerobic training was the big key to health and longevity, that had already kind of been built in. And then once again, it kind of becomes a bit of a feed-forward mechanism. That's getting into more of a kind of a commentary on science, but then understanding where it came from. If you guys want a bunch of good laughs, feel free to ask me about nutrition, because the beginning of nutrition research in this country is wild. Now, first we're going to have what's known as muscular strength. Strength is simply our ability to produce force. So there's going to be static strength, so it's how much force we can produce against a wall where nothing's going to move, and then dynamic of, well, how much force can we produce when we're moving something. Now, this could be on a type of exercise known as an isokinetic device, which only allows us to move at a certain speed, so much force can produce the range of motion. But typically, we're thinking about dynamic strength more as resistance training. So down there is a picture of a very strong friend of mine by the name of Matt Wenning, benching a crazy amount of weight, and I believe he did this one for 4 reps. So you're going to be, when you're talking about a 1 repetition, you're going to bring the bar down, press the bar back up, or squat the bar, deadlift the bar. Now, those movements, you can move them pretty slowly and still be successful with the lifts. Then you get into other movements that are very dynamic in nature, like the power clean, the snatch, the jerk, where you can't do it slowly. If you do it slowly, you're going to fail, so you have to move fast. So yes, you still need to have strength, but we're looking at more dynamic ends of the spectrum whenever we start putting in more of a speed component, which then gives us to what's known as power. Power is simply the force we're producing multiplied by the distance we're covering divided by the time it took us to do it. So work is just force times distance. So I can, pick up my wonderful tea cup and then walk it and set it across the room or all the way in the back of the room. Or I can just pick up the cup and just throw it and make it hit the back of the wall. In both cases, the same amount of work has occurred. The key difference between the two is power. In the second example, when I'm throwing it, it obviously goes there a lot faster. And hence power is what's really more important than strength when it comes to activities. Now, you have to have a certain amount of strength in the first place. So if you're not strong enough to move the object that is your goal in the sport, doesn't matter, we don't care about how powerful you are because you can't even move the object. And this is really important in things like football with linemen. If they're not even strong enough to push up against another lineman, well, it turns out who cares how powerful they are, they're not going to overcome the weight of the other individual. And that's where we need to make sure that we're putting tests in that are going to be specific with what we're looking for athletes. So good power tests could be things like the vertical jump, the broad jump, maybe your 10-yard sprint time, your 20-yard sprint time, even your 40-yard sprint time. And we're going to be able to measure this in a variety of ways. Now, the picture on the right is what's known as an isokinetic dynamometer. And it's going to go ahead and give us information as to how much force you're producing at different velocities. And this can be good because we can look at the force produced by your quads on the one side and your hams on the other. And we can see what's the ratio of the strength between the two, which actually is going to be something used in a lot of rehabilitation guidelines, specifically for individuals that have ACL surgeries. We then have muscular endurance. And this is our ability to perform multiple repetitions. So this is where we're going to do the 225 bench press test, which I've got an example of the table down there on the bottom of which is, okay, how many reps should an athlete be able to get at different positions? Then we're going to have things like the good old how many pull-ups can you do, how many push-ups can you do with the Presidential Fitness Challenge, along with obviously the testing required to go into a number of branches of the military. The PT test they have to go ahead and pass. Now, you're going to be able to get better at this from obviously gaining more strength, because it turns out you can probably do, whenever you're lifting your body weight, you're always lifting a certain percentage of it. And typically when you're doing a push-up, it's somewhere between 60 and 75% of your body mass. You're actually having to push with your hands when you're doing that push-up. Now, here's the thing. If you're able to bench press 100 pounds and you weigh 200 pounds, well, literally that's 75% of your own body weight going with your hands, 150 pounds. You can't even lift yourself. One push-up is mathematically impossible. However, if you can, say, bench press 300 pounds and you weigh 200 pounds, well, now that 150 pounds of your own body weight is only 50% of your max. It's going to be very easy for you to do a lot of repetitions. And then changes in the local metabolic and cardiovascular ability. So do we have more capitalization to the muscles that we're using? Do we have better development of the mitochondria? Do we have better development of just the cardiovascular system, more from the cardiac output, that vasodilation, the capillarization, and then our blood volume, and how that's going to enhance our performance. So here is an example of looking at some contrast from one athlete to another, where you can see, yes, the strength is going to be different from the athletes, the power is going to be different, and then in turn, so is going to be the muscular endurance. So even though athlete B is stronger than athlete A, they move the weight so slowly, they are actually less powerful than athlete A. And then at the same time, when it comes to repetition endurance, they would have, in this example, the best type of endurance, or the best endurance, but what type of sport do we really care more about the endurance than the maximal strength performance? And there are some. What sports do we care more about maximal power? What sports do we care more about maximal strength? So if your goal is to deal with linemen, and those linemen have to move another athlete that usually weighs around 130 to could be as much as like 150, 160 kilos, and we're going to say these are the squat maxes, well, it turns out athlete B and C are going to be your best choices. Now, if you're talking about someone that's going to hit hard for one play, athlete C is going to be your best bet. If you want someone that's obviously going to be able to recover or deal with longer bouts, it's going to be athlete B, but they're not going to be as powerful. And that gives us some ideas of what we need to train for. We then have aerobic power, and this is literally just the rate at which we can get oxygen to the muscles. So you guys can watch the video of me doing the critical power test, which just is not fun, but it gives you an idea of like what's the low-level output you can do aerobically for a very sustained period of time. And that's useful because, well, that's the background. Remember, that's the aerobic system that's going to be regenerating not just that lactic system, but also our ATP PCR. So we're going to be able to maintain our performance. So if we've got a higher aerobic power, we're going to be able to recover faster. Think about the difference between before the sickness came, when you could go play basketball with your friends. If you're in really good aerobic shape, you can run down the court, sprint down the court, and then jog back. And when you're jogging, you're actually recovering. If you're in okay shape, you can sprint down the court and you can walk back and be recovering while you're walking. But if you're in bad shape, you're going to be sprinting down the court and then you're going to be standing there with your hands on your knees, breathing hard for a number of minutes before you can go again. So we want to have an idea of that aerobic capacity of really any athlete, because it's going to play a bigger part in those energy systems in certain sports over others. But we still need to have a development of that system so that we can either excel at the sport or excel at the training. It's one thing to condition for your sport. So for example, the sport of softball, baseball, football, the game itself, depending on how it's played, is usually very easy metabolically. It's not hard to play the sport of baseball metabolically. Yes, the pitchers and catchers work harder, same thing with softball. However, it's metabolically stressful to get through the practices because you're going to be fielding a lot of balls, you're going to be taking a lot of batting practice, you're going to be practicing your skills over and over and over with very limited rest. So you need to be in shape in that sport for your practice. You do not need to be in shape for the game. And then the same thing when it comes to a football team, well, it turns out not all those athletes are going to get a lot of game time. So if you're not a starter, in reality, you need to be in shape for practice so that you can do rep after rep after rep to help drill your team on how to do the plays correctly. Now, anaerobic power is our ability to obviously produce energy in an anaerobic state. This is going to be a pretty good indicator of our ability to just deal with hard and high intensity work. I love the picture of this dude cheering this guy on the Wingate. I mean, he looks like he's trying to, get him to gain vengeance on those that killed his family. I don't know. It's amazing. But how much energy are we able to produce, or how much work are we able to do, how much power are we able to produce when we aren't able to maintain that with aerobic performance? And this can be really useful for things like throwers, football players, a lot of athletes that fight really hard in the anaerobic system, and is going to be incredibly high contributor to their success of performance. So now let's talk about the basic principles of training. The first principle to make sure you never violate is individuality. Everyone is not the same. Genetics are going to be a big effector of performance. Now, this is going to show itself in a variety of ways, which is how fast do we grow, how fast do we turn over our nutrients, how well does our cardiovascular and our neuroendocrine system regulate, and then how high or low do we respond. So let's break this down. Some individuals naturally adapt at a much faster rate to training than others. Some folks naturally adapt to much lower stimulus of exercises than others. Some of them need a lot more stimulus of exercise in order to adapt. Some people, thanks to how they're built, have natural mechanical advantages in sports. So certain movements are not as stressful for them, but for other individuals, they're very stressful. So an example of myself is I literally have, keep walking, keep walking, keep walking. I have a wingspan of 6'4" and I'm 5'10" on a very good day. So what this means is, thanks to how long my arms are and how long my legs are, when it comes to lifting weights, the deadlift is a very friendly movement for me because I don't have to move the bar through a very large range of motion compared to other people due to having really long arms. But whenever I lift with my friends that have got little T-Rex arms, the deadlift is a lot more stressful for them because they have to naturally get far further bent over in the movement. They have to get down a lot lower in order to pick up that weight. And the same thing is the opposite is going to be true when it comes to doing things like the bench press. I got a long distance to take that bar. Or if you got those T-Rex arms, it's just, and you're done. And I'm jealous, to be completely honest. But that's going to influence how stressful the program is going to be on one person than another. You've seen examples of really high level athletes like Michael Phelps' swimming program, marathoner training programs for like the elite level marathoners. They have very specific anthropometrics, skeletal system, limb lengths, limb sizes that gives them a natural advantage in those sports to start with, before we even start talking about the metabolic side, the growth rates and otherwise. All of these things are going to be influencing how we're going to respond. So when you see like, hey, you should follow, insert this person's program, well, you're not that person. You do not have the same training history as that person. You do not have the same genetics as that person. You do not have the same nutritional choices. And then let's be completely honest, in the days of social media and individuals that look really good but never really get tested, quite possibly steroid usage or other drug usage. And since you're not doing those things, you're not going to have the same results. So you need to make sure the program that you're working with is actually going to be based around how you respond individually. What's really interesting with high responders and low responders is most everyone responds to exercise once you give them a big enough dosage. Until you give them a big enough dosage, some folks won't really respond. Other folks only need to train once or twice a week, and they're going to be able to make good progress. Some folks, they're going to need to train, and when it comes to aerobic training, 3 to 5 times per week to make progress. And then other folks, when it comes to resistance training, they're just literally going to have to do more sets and reps in order to make progress compared to other folks that might only have to do a set or two, and they're going to make great progress. Now, the next massively important thing to understand is going to be the wonders of specificity, which is we're only going to adapt specifically to the exercise we're doing. Now, this is important because your body is adapting specifically to the things you're doing all the time. Your body is currently adapting to whatever position you're in. So if you're just sitting there hunched over for hours every single day, you're literally compressing the front of your vertebral body so that eventually you're going to be stuck in that position, along with lengthening those muscles of posture and ligaments, keeping you up posturally so that you're going to have that kyphotic posture as you get older. That's just your body adapting to the demands that you're giving yourself. Now, this is important because when it comes to sport, we have to make sure that we're stressing the body in ways that are going to be specific to our goals. So are we actually making sure we're adapting them to the demands of the sport? Now, that's going to involve, are we using the same muscles? Are we using the same muscles to the same intensity? Are we following those movement patterns to a certain degree? Are we making sure we're tapping into those motor fibers we're going to use? So on and so forth. Now, a number of individuals are going to make some well-meaning mistakes when it comes to this, which is they're going to be like, oh, I throw the baseball, so I need to do a lot of bench press. Well, this motion is a heck of a lot different than this motion. So the throwing motion is going to naturally involve obviously more rotation. It's going to involve the lats more. It's going to involve almost more of a pullover position. It's going to involve the deacceleration of the muscles that cause external shoulder rotation, and it's going to be involving the legs, the torso, and the hips to drive yourself forward. So by just training the bench press, you're actually doing yourself a disservice because you're not really training all of the muscles, and specifically the muscles and patterns that are going to have a much greater carryover to making you a better athlete in that sport. And just about every single sport, aside from ones involving swimming, you're going to be playing on your feet. Obviously, there's other sports where you're not, but since if we're playing a sport on our feet, we probably need to have stronger legs that are more powerful, that are mobile, that are able to put us in a good position. So we probably should have some lower body training in our program, and a lot of lower body training at that, because once again, that's how you move up and down a field. So when you're working with your athletes, you have to make sure that we're addressing all the things that we're looking for in order to get those enhancements. And then finally, it's not just the muscle we're using, but the individual fibers in the muscle. So if you look at the picture in the bottom left, you're going to see Henneman's size principle. And then if you're looking on the right, you're going to see how we're going to be tapping into our bigger muscle fibers whenever we're going at faster rates. And so if we really want to develop those type 2 powerful fibers for things like sprinting, running, jumping, etc., you need to make sure we're tapping into them in training. So we're not going to do endless sets of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 repetitions. Instead, we want to be hitting some very aggressive, for at least speed or just total load, sets of 5, so that we're going to be tapping in those type 2 fibers, developing them, because it's not just the muscle, it's the individual fibers we're actually recruiting. Now, we then have reversibility, which is rough, which is if you stop training things, you're going to go backwards. And that's completely normal. So when we train, we're going to be improving ourselves. When we stop training, everything goes backwards. Now, maximal strength and maximal aerobic performance actually hold on the longest. You're going to be losing, I mean, aside from full like comatose bed rest, but as long as you're still active and just living life, you're only going to lose about 5% of that maximal strength and maximal aerobic performance over the course of a month. It's your maximal speed that goes down first, followed by your anaerobic power, which is going to go down second. And we're talking about you're going to lose 5% of that max speed in a week, 5% of that anaerobic power in a week or two. And then mobility is one of those situations where same thing is going to start slowly moving back in about a month itself. Now, this is important because at certain points you're going to get to be so stressful with your life that you're not able to train as much as you'd like to. Or you're an athlete that's peaking for a competition. That means we can pull back on aerobic conditioning and strength training within a week or two of that real major competition, as long as we still have that anaerobic power and speed component. And then the week of, we can pretty much just make sure we're doing a little bit of speed work, and then otherwise we're going to be fine. And that's going to allow us to fully recover and make sure that we're going to do well without diminishing our performance in any of those areas significantly. Now, big component is to make sure that we are giving ourselves progressive overload. We are going to, every single time we train, most of the time when we train, you're going to take a deload on occasion. We're going to, over time, our program should be getting more difficult. We should be running the same distance in a faster time. We should be lifting the same load for more reps. We should be lifting a heavier load for the same reps. We need to be doing something that is constantly causing our program to become more difficult. Now, you don't always have to increase the amount of reps you're doing. You don't always have to increase the number of sets you're doing. You don't have to always increase the distance you're running, etc. You can obviously do the same amount of sets, same amount of reps, but take less time between each set. That's going to be a way of progressing your program. Obviously, same sets, same reps for a higher weight is going to be progressing your program. There's a number of different ways you can go about this, but every good program should have some form of progressive overload, because we are going to be asking ourselves to do more than we have done before, which in turn is going to help us become a better athlete. We then have our final principle, which is variation. This is really another term for the principle of periodization, which is we're not going to do the exact same workout over and over again without changing some things. What we're going to find is over long periods of time, we should initially start with a high amount of volume. So it's just a high amount of work you're doing at a low intensity. So like lighter percentage of 1RM, not as difficult if we're doing conditioning. And then over time, we're going to decrease that volume. So the total amount of sets, reps, distance we're running, and increasing the intensity that we're going at. Now, this is for more traditional, like lifting, weightlifting, peaking for different types of sport training, where we want to slowly end with a lower volume, higher intensity cycle that's really peaking us out for our competition. So a macro cycle is going to be what we're looking to do over an entire year. A mesocycle is what we're trying to do over effectively a couple months. And the microcycle is literally what are we doing in the week, which is what most people do. The real way of thinking about a microcycle is thinking about it as the duration of time it takes before your training or your training organization repeats. So let's say you, like all respectable humans should, you squat on Monday, because if you bench on Monday, you start the week on your back, you've already kind of started the week on a loss. So you should always start the week off squatting. So you squat on Monday, you do whatever exercises again, and then the next Monday you start squatting again. Your microcycle in that example is 1 week long, because you come back and you repeat back every single week. Now, some folks, they're going to run a kind of a bodybuilding split where they might do kind of an upper push, upper pull, lower body, day off, repeat. So effectively their microcycle is going to be 4 days long, because they're going to lift weights 3 days in a row, take 1 day off, lift weights 3 days in a row, take 1 day off. Some folks are on a 9-day cycle where they're going to heavy lower body, day off, heavy upper body, day off, 2 days off, heavy lower body, day off, heavy upper body, and then another day off, and then they're going to come back to that first lower body day. So your microcycle can be however long it works for your body and how well you recover. But remember, we have to be varying our program. Now, this doesn't mean we need to go too far to the end of the spectrum, like we're effectively doing what would be the typical strawman argument about CrossFit of, just the random number generator, every single workout's different. There's no real clear form of progression that you can see, and we change exercise every week. You're going to see a lot of variation in things like a West Side Conjugate program with at least the max efforts. And then other programs, you'll see some lack of variation, like the Bulgarian weightlifting. But the basic idea is you should be sticking with certain movements for at least a month, if not 2 or 3, before you switch them out for different movements. And that's fine. It is good to give yourself a variety of stimuluses. The easiest way to get overuse injuries is to keep doing the same movement pattern over and over and over again with no variation to them. So we do want to naturally challenge our body with slightly different movement patterns than what we're used to over time. So we're going to try to design a resistance program. First thing we need to figure out is, well, what are the muscle groups we need to use? What are the types of training that's going to work well for this athlete? What are the energy systems we need to make sure we're stressing so they're going to be good at either their sport or the training for their sport? And then what do we need for injury prevention? So we should be looking at holistically the individual and making sure we're approaching all of these concepts. So if you're working with a female soccer player, you know that they have a much higher risk for things like an ACL tear. They run on their legs. If they're not a goalie, aside from throw-ins, which is more of a pullover movement, they're not really using their arms other than just basic protection of the body, and then obviously to help out balance, locomotion, and body control. Now, types of training. They're going to be doing a lot of aerobic with a lot of interspersed sprints. We're going to be spending a lot of time in the aerobic and aerobic glycolytic, ATP PCR, and then a little bit of anaerobic lactic. So we need to make sure we're developing each of those appropriately. So you're just applying this logic to how the sport is really going to be played, how it's going to be practiced, and making sure that you're getting the program for the athletes so they're going to be able to excel. Now, when it comes to resistance training program, we should have a concentric, which is going to be the shortening, and an eccentric, which is going to be lowering, and then isometric is going to be holding that position. Now, we're going to get a greater amount of strength benefits whenever we happen to be making sure we have both an eccentric and concentric to the movement. Now, we're going to be really developing our real strength from concentric work, but we're going to be helping develop more muscle mass from the eccentric, controlling the bar down. We want to start off with our big, powerful muscles and complex movements and high intensity work, and then move our way into our smaller muscles, single joint exercises, and low intensity. So let's say you've got a workout where we're going to do cleans, we're going to do squat, we're going to do bench press, and we're going to do leg curls. You would do it in that order because the clean is the high intensity, multi-joint, large muscle groups, followed by both the squat and the bench press are multi-joint exercises, but notice that you're going to use larger muscle groups when it comes to squatting than bench pressing, regardless of how much bros like to only do upper body. And then you'd finish with that single joint leg curl because it turns out it's going to be much lower intensity and it's going to be working. Hamstrings are very important, but they're nowhere near as big with a collective amount of muscle using between all the other movements. Now, rest periods, this is where you can tell these folks have never really worked with anybody that strong. You need to give the rest periods according to what your goals are. Now, 2 to 3 minutes is going to be absolutely fine when we're dealing with someone that's intermediately trained. If you work with someone who has a huge aerobic battery, like a cross-country athlete, they might only need to take a minute between each set because they're just ready to go because they replenish ATP that fast. Meanwhile, if you're dealing with a super high-level power lifter, strongman, Olympic lifter, they're going to have to take possibly 5 minutes between each set just to clear and get their breath back because of the metabolic demands of doing those heavy sets of squats, deadlifts, Olympic lifting, or any of the other implements they might have to occur in the program. Now, what we can then have the static contractions and the isometric style training. It doesn't really work that well. There were some initial ideas that it might be very useful. It doesn't really seem to be that good, but it can be very useful for individuals that are immobilized in rehab. So at least they're contracting in something statically, getting the muscles to fire a little bit, getting some reorganization. It can also be an important thing to program in occasionally inside of a program, specifically if you want to kind of try what's referred to as a triphasic approach from Cal Dietz. He's the strength coach at the point of this recording in Michigan. Feel free to look him up. It could be something that might be useful for you guys to go ahead and give that a shot to. Where if you're using isometrics on occasion, it's going to help with the neural education and making it so the athlete understands, like, here's the part of the range of motion, here's how you really coordinate that muscle contraction to hold the most difficult part so that you're going to be able to fire, out of it with much greater ease in the future. Now, when in doubt, we want to go ahead and use free weights because Yes, we're not getting the same great amount of force in the muscle where machines can have cams, so that way we're going to be able to make it so that when we're at a point in the leverage where we have an advantage, we can make the weight feel heavier. When we're at a point where we're at a mechanical disadvantage, we make the weight feel lighter. But life happens to be free weights. So making so that people can control movements and actually have the ability to control the implements as they're moving it through a full range of motion. If your goal is to just build overall muscular bulk, machines are probably where you should live. Not that you shouldn't do any free weight exercises, you want to do both. But in reality, it turns out machines are much easier to learn and they're much easier to put maximal effort into because you don't have to worry about balancing. Anyone that has ever squatted a very heavy weight knows that there is a skill component to it too, because that weight, if you're not careful, is going to pull you forward if you don't set up correctly, or it can even go behind you, which is a crazy thing to watch if that ever happens. Now, when it comes to dynamic eccentric training, this is going to be the idea of where we're really doing some type of more like drop training, depth training, really potentially maximal negative exercises. Negatives meaning all you do is lower the weight, which is going to be a super heavy load that otherwise would crush you. Now, this can be a useful way to help increase strength, but it's something that should be used very seldomly, and when used should be well spotted, well controlled, because these are going to involve loads that are going to be absolutely massive that otherwise an athlete is not going to be able to do on their own, and is going to be massively increasing the risk of injury if you're not careful. Now, what we can find is that eccentric and concentric workouts is really the best way to go ahead and build that maximal strength, but the eccentrics itself are going to be really important for building muscle. So when we say you can't really build muscle concentrically only, think about something like swimming, where you're pretty much doing concentrically only movements. You don't really see people getting massive from just swimming, even though, I mean, yes, they have a slightly more developed back, but they're not going to be gigantic. Same thing with people that are into long distance biking, mostly concentric work. They don't get absolutely massive, but they are going to build some appreciable muscle mass. But if you throw in some resistance training on top of that, that's when we can start talking about developing a monster. Now, variable resistance training, those are going to use cams. Cams are going to change effectively the length of the lever arm, which in turn is going to make the movement easier, harder in different points of the range of motion. And this is the basics of a lot of the machine training you see, specifically machines that have essentially cables going through. You can see the cam on the back and kind of how the pulley system works in between. So it's going to make the object feel a little bit easier, make it a little bit lighter at different points. And that's fine if, once again, our goal is overall muscular development. But if our goal is really to develop athletic performance, we want to use something that maybe has accommodating resistance. And this is where you see people adding bands and chains to the barbell. Or you want to be making sure that you're doing your typical traditional barbell training with a lot of plyometric power style training to make sure that you're really developing both ends of the force velocity curve. Now, isokinetic is where we're going to be able to move at the same velocity no matter what we want. I've gotten to use these before that were a compound exercise, and the squat machine for this thing felt like being in a human trash compactor, because no matter how hard you push, the thing was still going to drive you down. It was absolutely horrible. I didn't really see much of a training effect other than I guess it made me tougher, because once again, you feel like you're going to die because it's just crushing you no matter what you do. Plyometrics are going to be very useful for athletes once we've developed them to a certain extent, because now we're going to talk about improving muscle spindle function, decreasing Golgi tendon sensitivity, and really helping them learn how to use the stretch shortening cycle. So when they're going to go ahead and get the muscle to stretch under the eccentric load rapidly and then contract and then drive ourselves into a concentric, this is going to be where you're going to see some people doing plyometric jumps up to the box, where this guy is doing an awkward prison position, but it's going to be a useful method. The key is be careful with the amount of volume you're using, and obviously make sure you have really good technique. If you're doing a bunch of takeoffs and landing with bad technique, that is a great way to deeply upset your joints in a short period of time. You do not want to do that. Now, we can then just bypass that all and just hook you up to a car battery and make it ride. So this can be useful for individuals that are having issues with activating muscles or they're recovering from surgery. And so you're going to go ahead and literally hook up a stimulator to the muscle or to the nerve running to the muscle to get that muscle to contract. Doesn't seem to actually help increase muscle hypertrophy if you're already a trained individual, but it can be a useful thing to help abate loss due to immobilization and or to help with recovery whenever we're going through rehab. It is usually really uncomfortable because you literally have to shock the muscle into working. I personally, not a fan. I've done this before for research projects for friends, and I would prefer to avoid this if at all possible. Now, you see folks talk a lot about how we need core stability and core strength in order to be a really good athlete. I want you guys to really take all that stuff and just not so much throw it in the garbage, but think of performance as we need to look at the way an athlete's performing and look at where are they improperly innervating. So they're strong enough, they just don't know how to use that muscle mass, which is possible. But then where are they leaking force? Leaking force is any point in which they're not getting a good exchange of force production from one part of the body to the other. Now, this is where the core can't happen. Because if we look at the skeleton on the right, notice we've got this thick rib cage that relatively stabilizes our thoracic spine. We then have this thick bony pelvis, and then in between, we've got this slinky called the lumbar spine. So yes, you could have issues transmitting that force from your lower body to your upper body if that slinky is not strong enough to effectively work like it was a rib cage or a pelvis, and that requires it to be strong enough to hold that position. And if you guys have never lifted really heavy weight, I thoroughly suggest doing some snatching, doing some clean and jerks, doing some heavy squatting and heavy deadlifting. And trust me, if you don't feel your core firing when you're using them or when you're doing that, you did not go heavy enough, or you didn't even try. So you're going to find that you can do a variety of methods to actually enhance that core stability. Don't think it needs to be yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, working on a physio ball. Instead, think of it along the lines of, are we strong enough that we can stabilize our body and get it to move? Another part where people have a lot of force leakages is through the scapula. The scapula are free floating. So the only way we stabilize them is with our muscles that are going to stabilize our scapula. So if you don't have a strong enough traps, rhomboids, serratus anterior, pec minor, all of those muscles that are involved in controlling your scapula, you're not going to be able to transmit that force, once again, as well, from your arms to your body, from your body to your arms. So we have to look for those force leakages. If you have a weak foot, you have weak ankles, you're going to see them bend their ankle when they try to push off the ground. They're going to be driving themselves on the heel because they're not strong enough there to transmit the force being produced by their knees and their hips. So there's a lot of way that we can fail. The key is to look around and understand, because the other problem is where we're leaking force is also where we're likely to be injured. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to stabilize those joints, to keep ourselves in correct position so that we're always going to be able to control ourselves. Now, one thing that is important there is your core musculature, your spinal erectors, your traps to a lesser extent. They're very much so type 1 muscle fiber, or they're heavily type 1 muscle fiber muscles. So that means literally you want to train them with multiple sets and higher repetitions, because it turns out that's what they're going to respond very well to. And we're going to find that our power training is going to be very important for the sport that we're working with. And remember my caveat of it's not just training for the sport, but it's also training for the training of the sport, okay? Making sure that we have our athletes, that they're in good enough condition so that they're going to be able to do a number of repetitions and be able to practice their sport over and over again. And then here's just kind of the example of thinking about what energy system you're really working on when you're doing different types of distances with your athlete. So what we have here is the ACSM's, American College of Sports Medicine's basic ideas of resistance training and the loading we should use. And this is how I know they have no idea what they're doing, because they say for strength development advanced, an athlete should be doing multiple sets of 1 to 12 reps with 80 to 100% of their max. Most people can do 10 reps with 75% of their max and do a set of 12 with like closer to 70% of your max. Very few mere mortals can do a set of 12 with 80% of their max with good technique. That is straight up Fruit Loops. So same type of situation of going and doing 70 to 100% of your 1RM, even with an emphasis all the way up to 85% of sets of 1 to 12 for hypertrophy. It's just insane. That's not how it works. You shouldn't be trying to do hypertrophy work in such high percentages, because you can't get enough sets per rep or reps per set. And it's really, really stressful on the body. You want to give them a chance to go ahead and recover. When it comes to power, you don't have to work at super high repetitions. You can be working at lower percentages of your max. You can work at higher percentage of your max. The big key is emphasis on power, on speed. And you need to keep your sets can be whatever you want. Your reps, though, need to stay low. And I would say you should never go over 5 repetitions. And that's where I like the NSCA's basic repetition maximum continuum of what are we really emphasizing. You're never only training hypertrophy. You're never only training strength. What you're going to see is a certain amount of carryover is going to be more emphasized, and that's going to be the yellow bands when you're working around certain reps. Now, when you then are going to get lower effects whenever we happen to be training at the blue, and then we get the least when we're over in the green. So if you want to try to train in a way that's giving you a good mix of just kind of developing everything in the first place, it's usually sets of 8 to maybe 12 reps. You're going to get strength, you're going to get power, you're going to get a lot of hypertrophy, and you're going to get a bit of muscular endurance. If you really want to try to develop that strength and power, notice you got to go low rep, but then we're barely getting any hypertrophy effect, we're barely getting muscular endurance effect. And then same thing, if we want endurance, well, it's time to start doing the high rep stuff. And I would argue the hypertrophy is going to follow it pretty well too, even when you get into the sets of 20. But yes, you are not getting anywhere near the same amount of strength and power adaptation the higher reps would go. And the Prilipin chart was just a major meta-analysis of Olympic lifters and looking at like how many reps and how many sets did they do at different percentages of their max. Now, this is with Olympic lifts per session that seemed to give the athletes the best outcomes as far as performance. So yeah, if you're going to be doing training at 90% or more of your max, you're going to be doing that for only sets of 1 to 2, maybe 3 reps if you really want to shout at the devil. Whereas if we're going to be in the 80 to 90% range, now we're talking about 2 to 4, could be as high as maybe 5 or 6, especially if we're at that 80% max. We once again want to make things really difficult. And how many reps do we really need to do in order so we're going to get a really good training effect? Because training isn't about just beating yourself down. If it was a perfect relationship to how sore and how beat up you were and how much progress you made, then everyone would just be Tyrannosaurus wrecking themselves all the time. But that's not how it works. You need to be able to recover from your training. So if you're doing too high of intensity, too much volume, too much work, you're not going to be able to make as much progress. In fact, you're going to be biting yourself in the butt because you're not going to be able to do as much work. You're not going to be able to recover from it in time. So what we want to do is stimulate the body optimally, not maximally. So there's a number of ways that we can develop anaerobic and aerobic power, one of which is interval training, which is we're going to do a high intensity work and then low intensity work. And this is a great way to go ahead and try and help develop that aerobic capacity and a bit of that anaerobic tolerance. And this is not fun, but you can still do essentially a sprint down the field, jog back, run down the field, well, sprint down the field, walk back, run down the field, jog back, something where you're oscillating back and forth and make the distances make sense for whatever you happen to have your athlete doing. So we want to make sure that we understand, yes, how much should we be exercising for? What should be that total distance? So if we're talking about maybe a softball athlete, it's going to be a sprint. And then the distance, well, turns out if a softball athlete is sprinting more than, it's highly unlikely they're going to do it inside the park home run. But there might be a chance where they're going to be able to run a triple. So the greatest distance you're going to have them covering, since the distance from home to first is only 60 feet, you're only talking 60 yards of full max sprinting. And then typically they would then be hanging out. But we would now like, hey, maybe have them walk, do kind of aerobic component, but still give them a recovery, and then sprint again, walk, sprint, walk, sprint, walk, sprint. And then think about, well, the kids probably only get maybe 4 or 5 at bats. Over the course, oh no, they usually play doubleheader. So we'll figure it's gonna be 10 at bats, and if each time they're hitting a triple, that's still, we're only talking 10, 60-yard sprints. And then they're gonna be out there fielding. Well, if they're an outfielder, they might be running decent distances out in the outfield. But if they're a first base woman or third base woman, they're not really running that much of a distance anyways. So we don't need to worry about having them doing as much volume, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're thinking all of these variables through. Now, another thing we can do is base it off of intensity. So, which is we can say it's going to be, this is how long you have to do it, this is how far you have to go, or this is the heart rate max we want you to have you at. And this is where we can have them literally wear a chest strap where we can see what is their heart rate going to be. Now, the percentages they're giving you for the ATP PCR system, anaerobic and aerobic, when we say intensity, we're going to be thinking about effort. And that might not be always the exact same number as the heart rate. And you still want to think about, are they going to be below or above that anaerobic threshold of where we're talking about hitting the lactate threshold and the ventilatory threshold. So thinking of those things whenever we're training the intensity and what are going to be your indicators you're trying to work with your athlete. Now, heart rate max is going to be a pretty darn good indicator of how hard someone happens to be working. Whereas, these are, once again, kind of giving you some ideas. Some folks aren't going to really, they're going to hit that anaerobic glycolytic training at only 70% of their max. Some of them might not hit it until they get to 90+% of their max. But it's still going to give us some straight up information on what's going on, because this is important. Because if we have the athletes all conditioned together, well, your most in shape athletes, if everyone has to make the same time, they're going to have the easiest conditioning because they're already in really good shape. They're going to be able to recover very easily. It's not going to be that difficult for them to keep it up. Whereas if your athletes are not as in good condition, they're going to be the ones that are struggling the entire time. So they're getting a really big training stimulus where your best athletes are slacking off. So if you can have all your athletes wearing a heart rate monitor, you can literally see who are the kids that are giving it their all, who are the kids that are really slacking off, and in between, because, you know, some of the training sessions aren't meant to pound people down into dust. Some of them are meant to just kind of be a nice recovery. Others aren't meant to be really difficult, but we can still make sure the athlete is being trained to the level they need to. So the distances. So if we know what the athlete is going to go ahead and be having to perform in their sport, we can get an idea of the distance we're going to have them go for the sprint training. Now, sprint training, the 30 to 200 meters, once again, these are nice folks, but I don't think they really worked with many athletes. If you have an offensive lineman sprinting 30 meters, things might not necessarily be going very well. So instead, we want to focus on maybe having them push a sled for 10 yards and having them do repeated bouts of that, since that's going to have a much greater amount of carryover. And not that you can't have them running across the field. We can think about going further and shorter with those distances, but we still want to make sure that we're doing something to really make sure that they are having to cover distances and develop that energy system ability for that sport. And then we're going to have periods of time we're going to have them doing massive distances. And this is where we're going to maybe just have them go and run distance, or just say, hey, you're going to run however far you make it in half an hour, as a way to just build that aerobic component or that aerobic capacity of the athlete, and it allow them to kind of auto-regulate based upon their own ability. So how much work we're going to do is really going to come down to the sport. If you're going to do a really high intensity exercise, we can do more repetitions and sets of it. We're going to do really long intervals. We're not going to do as many repetitions. So we could do 10 40-yard sprints, and that's just going to give us 400 yards of work. But if you had them just do 2 400s, now they've done 800 yards of work, and those are much more anaerobically stressful, which are harder to recover from. So the duration of a rest interval is going to be very much so based upon what we're trying to do. Personally, I think what you should go ahead and aim for, the heart rate is going to drop to a certain range, and then they can go ahead and do their next set. So we want to see that they're getting their heart rate down to 130 or 150 or something along those lines, and then it's time to go again, which is great because it's not, we all wait the same period of time and then we go. So some athletes were maybe not as well recovered, so they're not going to be as great of an effort. And then other athletes have been well recovered for a while. So by having them stand there around with everyone else, they're not going to get as big of a training effect. So heart rate recovery can be a very useful means to go ahead and look at a way to program based upon athletes' individual abilities. So the higher their exercise intensity, the lower the recovery intensity. So if we're sprinting, we're walking. If we're running, then we can be jogging. There's nothing wrong with oscillating between the two. And as we get to be in better and better shape, we can go at higher intensity and we can go ahead and rest less. We're going to find that, yes, if we're on the land, that can be that walking or a light jog. If we're swimming, we can be swimming a little bit, maybe treading water, or just resting. And how often we're going to do it is going to be very much so based upon what's the purpose with our athlete, what are we looking for. So we're going to see, you know, if you're just playing on a sport, we only really need to do some form of conditioning 2 to 4 times per week, and that might be built into playing the sport and practicing it. That's fine. But if we're trying to be a really good runner, we're trying to be a really good swimmer, we might be training every single day and sometimes doing multiple training sets per day. Now, you can do continuous training, and this is going to be where you're just going a set distance, like that's going for that long run. This can be really useful as a way to help improve your aerobic capacity in your body. And that's absolutely fine if that's our goal with our athlete. If you're going to do this with something like a football lineman, you're more likely to beat them up and not really get a lot of positive changes other than a lot of griping. So long, slow distance, that's the thing where you can go ahead and just go hang out and go for a long run. It's easy to take this literally too easy. you need to effectively get this up to a high enough intensity that you're at least forcing your body to work at a significant percentage of what your capabilities are. And what we can then think of is not necessarily the distance, but keep the speed. So the basic idea is that we're going to have them go, and it's like, hey, you're going to run at a 10-minute mile pace initially, so that's 6 miles an hour. That's pretty friendly. And for half an hour, and then we're going to have you try to go at a 9.5-minute mile pace, and then a 9-mile pace, and keeping that up for half an hour. So yes, they're going further, but they're going to go ahead and eventually be going at a better speed, or vice versa. We're going to have you go week 1. I just want you to run constantly for 15 minutes. And then it's going to be 16 minutes. And then it's going to be 17 minutes. And then we're slowly increasing it over time as a means to make sure that we're in really good shape. Now, we can then do Fartlek, which is where you're going to do kind of a sprint, jog, sprint, jog, sprint, jog. We can develop this to go ahead and use for different distances. This can be sprinting up a hill and then jogging down it, sprinting up a hill and jogging down it. Something where we're going to give people more options on how they're going to train as they're going to be going through the programming. And then finally, we have the wonders of circuit training. So this can be really useful because instead of just doing the jog, run, sprint, we can also have them do something like you're going to slide out, slide back, or you can do a box drill where they jog forward, slide across, back pedal, jog, slide the opposite direction, jog, slide, back pedal. And that can be useful for athletes, maybe like rugby players that need to go ahead and hold their position. So that way they are going to be able to stay up on the front line and be able to defend, but have that aerobic capacity to stay in constant relative movement in not great distances, but constant change to direction and motion. So went through a lot here, guys. Obviously, re-listen to anything you had questions, comments, concerns on. Take your time going through it. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. Otherwise, stay safe out there and have a great day.